Hello everybody and welcome back to Demystifying Inventory Systems. Last week, if you remember, we went ahead and I believe last week we did the interaction system, as well as you can see, when I press the interact button, we get the information from the item and send it to our on-screen widget, which is of course just a little block off to the right there. Let's take that block and expand it to a little bit bigger of an inventory system. If you remember, we have the W item slot here. What we're going to do is we're actually going to create a new widget. So we're going to right click, we're going to go and make a user widget here. I'm going to do W for widget underscore, and we'll just call this like an inventory grid. Save that and open it up. Now what we're going to do is I want to go up here to the top right and change the fill screen to desired. And then on the left hand side, I want to go ahead and get a, you want to do a size box? We'll do a size box. We'll go ahead and grab a size box and add it to the inventory grid here. Like I mentioned last time, the reason we add the size box is this lets us go ahead and set exactly the width and height that we want. If you are going to set up your user interface to be able to be a bit dynamic, if they have a smaller screen or a larger screen, especially if they're on a cell phone, you might want to consider instead setting a minimum and a maximum height. And what that'll do is basically it'll try to scale the element to better fit the situation. Obviously staying within certain constraints. However, for the sake of this tutorial, we are going to just go ahead and make it something really simple. I'm going to do like a width of like 500 and we'll do a height of like 300. Then within the size box, we are going to create an overlay. This is going to make it so elements can be on top of each other if we choose to do that. Then what we're going to do is we are going to add an image, and we will put that in the overlay, and this will just be our background. This will be the thing that just gives it a anchor on the screen. First thing I'm going to do though is click on it on the left hand side here, and I'm going to rename it. Instead of image 97, we're going to make this image background. Then if we scroll down here, we'll see that we have a brush. I'm going to leave it on none for now, but we're going to take that image size and we're going to make it the same as our dimensions. So the X will be 500 and the Y will be 300. Then we'll go to the color and opacity. I'm going to click on this little box here, which will give us a tool to change it. I'm not going to actually change the actual color. All I'm going to do is bring it down on the brightness value, so it's a little bit of a darker gray. Fun fact, that is why whenever you are initially getting your widgets set up, a lot of developers will call it gray boxing. It basically means getting the functionality in without having any of the art assets. Now we have this box here. What we're going to do is we're going to add a grid panel. Or even better, do a uniform grid panel. And we are going to drop that onto the overlay, not the background, but the overlay. For the alignment, we're just going to go ahead and do fill and fill because we want it to take up the whole thing. However, because we don't want it to hit the exact edges, we want a little bit of justification. I'm going to go up here on the padding and I'm just going to type in 5, and that'll bring it in just slightly, so that way it's not hitting the exact edge, which honestly we could even go a little bit higher. We could do like a 10. There we go. I think I'll do a 10. And then this is where a lot of math starts to come in if you want this to look really good. And what I mean by that is if we go over to our item slot, so this is the thing that is currently on our screen when we hit play. If we go to the size box, I don't know what this red thing is, ignore it. I think it has something to do with this. Anyway, we have a width and height of 50. So if we want this to fit correctly, we have to consider a few things. The first being that our size box is set to 500 by 300, which means that would be 10 of those elements because it's 50. So 50 times 10 is 500. And then of course we have 300. So 50 times 6 would be 300. So it'd be 10 by 6. However, we have to consider something. We added a padding of 10 to every side. So that's 10 on top, 10 on bottom, and 10 on the sides, which means that that is going to be minus 20 from the width and the height. So to easily fix this, I'm going to go to my size box and I'm going to add 20 to each of these. So let's do 520 by 320. And then we have to adjust the image to be, oh, I didn't mean to do that, 520 by 320. And now it will be 500 by 300 again. And we can set our minimum desired slot width to 50 and the minimum desired slot height to 50 as well. However, that's going to be if we don't want the slots to also have padding, which in order to make it look well, we're gonna need to add padding to those. So let's use a nice round number to keep it simple. We're gonna do a little bit less than the edge, so we'll do 5 on the slot padding. So now we have to do even more math. If you remember, a row, I believe left to right is row and top to bottom is column. So a row, if we click on our size box, is currently 520, which means that in theory we could fit 10 of those icons from left to right. But each slot padding now has a width of 5. So we need to add 10 boxes to this, and they're not going to be perfect. And 10. Boom, perfectly sized. So let's go ahead and count how many spots there's going to be padding. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. So we have 11 spots that are going to need padding. 11 times 5, because each side of the padding is 5, will be 55. 520 plus 55 is 575. So let's go back to our size box and we're going to make the width 575. Boom, which of course we will have to adjust the image again to also be 575. Boom. So now each of these buttons will fit perfectly from left to right 10 times using a padding of 5 and having the uniform grid panel have a padding of 10. But we're not done because we also need to do this from top to bottom. However, since you know the process now, I'll just go ahead and give you the number. The Y will be 555, which means we also need to set the size box to wait, did I say 500? I meant 355. Hold on, did I do that wrong? Yeah, 355, apologies. We will go ahead and hit compile and save. And now we have a 10 by 6 grid with elements that are 50 by 50 with a padding from the outer edge of 10 and a padding around each icon of 5. Okay, but how do we populate this thing? Well, we're gonna have to do some programming for that. Go ahead and go onto the uniform grid panel and make sure this is indeed a variable, as we are going to need access to it. Other than that, we can go ahead and switch over to the graph, which is up here at the top right hand side. Because we made it a variable, you'll see over here on the left hand side, we have the grid. I'm gonna go ahead and create a custom event and we're just gonna call it populate grid. In order to populate the grid, we are going to need some information. So let's go ahead and click on populate grid and demand that information. We are going to need an input and we're just going to call this item data. Oh, don't put a space. Good naming conventions. Item data, and we are going to make this that struct that we created of struct item. We will go ahead and grab our uniform grid panel and do a get. We're going to pull out of the uniform grid panel and we're going to type in add child. However, we don't want just add child, we want the add child to the uniform grid. We'll plug that straight over. And you'll see that we have a couple of things we need to figure out. The first is content-wise, what do we put in for content? Because we can't just take the data and plug that straight in. And as you can see, we also need to know what row and column we are placing that item in. So we've got a little bit to figure out here. I'm gonna go ahead and make some space. We're going to unplug the execution pin. And instead what I'm going to do is out of the populate grid, let's go ahead and create a widget. The class will be the icon, the item slot that we created, which of course will give us a return value, which will end up being the content. However, we need to do some things with that return value first. As you can see, on the item slot, we created a custom event called add item to slot, which requires that we give information. So out of that return value, you can actually access that. So we're going to add an item to slot, not slow, but to slot, which requires an item. So we can just take that item data and plug it directly in. And then to make it look a little bit nicer and easier to read, let's go ahead and add a couple of pins like that. Double click the line in case you weren't aware. And now we've created a slot. We've added the information to it. And now we can immediately add it to the uniform grid, which of course the content will actually be not the item data, but that return value that we just created out of the widget. However, we still have a couple of problems to solve. Right now, we're taking the one item that we have, we're creating a slot, and then we're adding it to the grid, but we don't know where to put it, and as well as this is always only going to create one slot, specifically at 0, 0. So this is unfortunately going to have to get slightly more complicated. We need to do a little bit of math. Let's go ahead and create two public variables that are going to be integers. Or actually, it'll be 3 variables, but we'll start with this one. The first one is going to be our inventory size. Then we'll create a new one, and we're going to call this current row. We're going to create another one, and we're going to call this current column. Now, I'm going to be absolutely clear here because on this channel, I need people to understand what's going on. So in order for that to happen, you need to understand where I'm at. I know for a fact there's got to be a way to dynamically adjust the incoming item slots to populate to the size of the inventory. And I'm sure there's some modular way to do it so it doesn't matter what the inventory size is, it knows how to do the math and handle it. I do not know how to do that, and I think it's important that I tell you that. However, how we're going to do it works just fine. There's just a couple extra steps anytime you go to create a new inventory, like setting the max amount of inventory slots, as well as how far should a row go, how far or how many columns should there be, etc. So let's go ahead and create a new function, and this is going to take care of the in row and the in column for us. So let's call this slot placement. So this will be a function for whatever slot we need handled. And what we're going to do is we are going to take the current row. So remember, rows are left to right. And if you remember, whenever we set up the designer here, we can have 10 from left to right. So whenever we head back to our function for slot placement, we're going to see, is the current row greater than or equal to 10? Now you might be thinking, why do we need to check and see if it's greater than? Anytime you add something like, is it equal to this? Not always, but a lot of times you want it to make sure that it's also going past what you want, just in case some kind of error happens. Like for example, what if slot placement runs twice in a row before the variable updates? Again, very unlikely, but let's say it did happen and now you're at 11. Well, it's never going to equal 10 if it's adding to it. It's going to go from 10 or from 11 to infinite. So by adding the greater than, you're basically just adding in an additional layer of protection. You're saying, hey, if this goes past 10, if this gets to 10, stop. But if it goes past 10, also stop. And we'll go ahead and add a branch because this is where we're going to start deciding what to do. For example, if it is greater than or equal to 10, we need to do two things. We need to go to the current column and we need to add 1. Now, there is multiple ways to do this, but I'm gonna show you something cool. Yes, you can do add. Oh, not add to viewport. We don't need that. We can do the operation add, and we can just do add 1, and then you take current column, and then you set it, and then this is how most new people do it. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with this. But there is a little bit of a cleaner way to do it, and it's a bit faster. If you come out of current column and you just do ++, you're gonna get an increment integer. And what's awesome about increment integer is it automatically knows to set current column. So this is adding 1 and setting it all in one node, which is 10 times easier and cleaner than doing it the other way. So as I said, our current row is at its max. So we need to go to the next column, but also we need to reset our row back to 0. So we're going to get our current row and we're going to hit set, and we're going to set the current row to 0. And then it's as simple as that. We're going to right click and we're going to add a return node. And we are going to return the row and the column. And let's rename those. So this one is the row. So we'll just call this out row. And this will be the out column. The reason we're not just calling them column and row is just simply so we know the difference between whether or not it's just doing the current or it's doing the operation and then sending it back. Now, technically, we're setting the current and then returning that set, I'm aware, but it's good to differentiate. So what's happening? We got to row 10, or we passed it, hopefully not. So we need to go to the next column, go back to the first row, and then we return it and let it know that's where we're at. So the reason, by the way, that current row is 0 and not 1 is because in the grid panel, it is considered an array. So with arrays, the first element is always 0. It is not 1. It is the new person's worst nightmare. Don't blame me. All right, but what happens if the current row isn't at 10? Well, let's use our new trick. Let's get the current row, and we're going to do ++, which is an increment of the integer, and we're going to move to the next row. So we increment our row, and we don't need to do anything with the column. So in this case, we're going to take our return node, and we're going to take the current row, send it through after the increment, of course, and then we just need to take the current column because it hasn't been changed and output it, and we'll hit compile and save. So now what we need to do is get our, let's move this over. Let's move where we're adding it over. Let's undo the execution pin and let's pull our new function out. So now whenever we get to here, we are going to run our slot placement function so we know where we're at in the grid, and we'll plug all this in like that, and bam. So every time we run populate grid, we are going to create a widget for a slot. We're going to add the info to that slot. Then we're going to update our slot placement and add it to the correct position. Now there's a couple questions we still don't have answered. Like for example, right now this would still only run once, right? Because we'd run the populate grid, it would create a widget, it would try to add an item to slot, and then it would just stop. It'd be like 0, 0, move on, we're done. So we have that problem. And then the other problem is we have an inventory size that's not being filled with empty, right? Because whenever you have an inventory, those slots still exist, they're just empty, whereas right now that wouldn't happen. So let's solve this one problem at a time. The first problem we are going to solve is getting this to run the exact amount of times that there is for the inventory size. So let's create a custom event. And you know what? I'm actually going to do a little bit of renaming. We're actually going to call this add filled slot. So what this is going to do now is basically anytime we need to add a slot that's filled, we've got the perfect function for it. Or custom event rather. However, now we're going to create something called populate grid that's going to run as many times as we need to in order to fill the inventory. By the way, if you are following along and it wouldn't let you name populate grid, it's because you didn't compile and save after changing the last custom event. So make sure you save and compile, and then you should be able to take that name again. So populate grid is going to do something for us. We're going to click add on it. And instead of taking one item, it's actually going to take the array. So we're just going to call this items. And we're going to leave it as struct item, but we're going to right click, or actually you can't do that in widgets. We're just going to click on this little dot here and change it to an array. And then we're going to do a for each loop. So for every item that's coming in, we're going to run some logic. For those that don't know how for each loops work, we have a list of items. One item gets pulled out, goes into the for each loop, and then gets pumped out right here. Now, the reason that's important is because loop body is going to run this logic for every single item that comes through. So let's go ahead and set this up to check if the slot is full or empty. So what we're going to do is on the array element, we're actually going to go ahead and pull it out, and we're going to do a break just so we can see the kind of stuff we're dealing with here. And you'll note that we have a name, which is a string of text. I'm going to pull out of name, and I'm just going to do an equal case insensitive. We're going to make a branch, and we're going to plug that loop body in. What that's going to do is, let's say we make several different inventories and we want them to be able to manipulate the inventory so that way it's not always the first slots are filled. You know how in some cases you might move an item from up here to down here, so therefore there's empty space between? Well, this is just future-proofing our inventory system, so if we ever do get to that point, this will basically say, is this slot filled? Because if it's empty, it's not filled. If it is filled, we know what to do. We have add filled slot. So out of true, we're gonna add filled slot. Or I digress. No, this says, is it empty? If it is not empty, there we go, apologies. We want to add a filled slot. And of course, the item data is just going to be that out element. So let's go ahead and double click and go ahead and clean this up a little bit. Okay, cool. And then what we need to do is we need to be able to add an empty slot. So we have filling a slot. Let's go ahead and move this down, and we'll create a custom event, and we're going to call it add empty slot. It's going to be very similar. In fact, we can actually go ahead and copy and paste this code down. The difference, of course, being that we don't need these two, because the add item to slot, we're going to leave empty. So therefore, whenever it comes through, we can manipulate it to be something different. So let's go ahead and split this. We are going to have to move these dots, though. Can I get this one? I got it. Perfect. Item name, we could just do like empty slot or whatever you want it to say. You can even set a static mesh if you want. There's really no reason to. Item description, we can literally just do like the slot is empty. And then you can even set up an icon if you'd like for whenever slots are empty. So if it is empty, so if it's true, then we just need to add an empty slot. However, we still have one last problem that really needs to be addressed. We can take an incoming inventory and we can either add a filled slot or an empty slot based on the data. However, we aren't going to fill our grid if the incoming inventory isn't the exact same size. So right now, remember how we future-proofed it and said, hey, check and see if it's empty. If it is, just add an empty slot. Well, that works for later down the road, but what if there's only like 3 items in our inventory and we don't have a bunch of empty data? Like there's not a bunch of empty slots, right? Like the struct array literally has 3 items in it and that's it. Right now, the code is only going to run until those 3 are in, and then it's just gonna stop. So what I want to do is, we have an inventory size. Let's go ahead and do another one, and we're just gonna call it number of slots. And by another one, I apologize, I mean another integer. And we're gonna go ahead and pull this over, and we're going to get number of slots, and I'm simply going to do an increment that no matter if it is a filled slot or an empty slot, it is going to increment up 1. So let's go back to our example. We have 3 items that are coming in. Shunk, shunk, shunk. Our inventory now has 3 slots and that's it. And we know that because we have number of slots here that gets incremented every single time a slot gets added. So whenever this is complete, whenever we're like, okay, the inventory logic is done, let's populate the rest of it so that way it's the correct size, we can just run a complete here. Out of the complete, what we're gonna do is we're actually just gonna do add empty slot. So what just happened is it did all 3 that are in the inventory for this example, and then it finished. So what we're gonna do is out of the complete slot is we need to check. We actually need to check. So let's get number of slots. And we're gonna say, is number of slots greater than or equal, and I've explained why we do that, greater than or equal to the inventory size that we've set, and that'll of course be a branch, which is B and click. If it is not, then what we need to do is we need to add another empty slot. So add empty slot and increment the number of slots that we've created. And this is where we get to create our own little loop. We just keep checking this over and over and over until it's done. So we can take this execution pin, plug it right back into the branch. And then I like to make my lines do this because it looks like a nice little loop whenever I get it set up right. Maybe a little bit taller there. There, something like that. And there you go. Now, this is where we need to do one little last thing of math, and we should be nice and set up here. What we need to do, let's get out calculator. If you remember, we can have 10 slots a row, and we can have 6 columns. So 10 times 6 is 60. So we know that how our current setup is set up, the inventory size is going to be 60. So make sure you set that over here on the left hand side and hit compile and save. So let's go back to where we created this little element that's on our screen right here. And instead, let's create the inventory. As you remember, on the first person character, we had a debug widget, which is just creating the game HUD. So what we need to do is actually just go put the inventory on the HUD, which was in our widgets folder for the in-game HUD. You'll see there's a little icon, let it delete. And instead, let's go ahead and add that inventory grid that we created, which as you'll see by default is empty. It won't populate on this widget. I am gonna set the anchor to the right-hand side, and the specifics don't really matter that much. We'll hit compile and save, as long as it's in a relatively decent position. And whenever you go to populate the inventory, this is important. If I hit play right now, you'll notice something. It's there. Notice that it's not populated. We have yet to call in the inventory grid any of this. None of this is going to run. So, depending on your use case, when this widget gets created, that is when that inventory needs to be ran through this code. So that way, whenever it gets created, boom, there's the inventory. As well as anytime it needs to update. They sold something, they bought something, they deleted something, they picked something up. All those are situations that you have to update the inventory. And you do that by simply populate grid. So in this case, we're not doing anything to cause the inventory to be open. It's just open by default. So where I'm going to do this is on its construction, the event construct. It has been constructed. So let's go ahead and run the populate grid. Now, because of how I'm doing this, there won't be any items. Normally, we're going to want to set this up inside the character when the player hits a button, when the player opens up a vendor, that kind of thing. But because we're doing this with no connections, we're doing this as a test. We're saying, hey, I need you to populate this grid the second the game says go. Don't worry about what's in it. We're going to do it like this. We're just going to say on your event construct, I need you to populate. Don't worry about the items. And as you can see, there won't be any items. So let's go ahead and hit play. And there you have it. It did populate, but notice that it's not nearly what we thought it was going to be. We have the white for the background, and that's what those streaks are. But notice that they're all touching and weird and not great. So the error is in my math. It actually has to do with the math that I did, specifically in the slot placement. So the error has to do with the math that I was using in the inventory grid, specifically in our slot placement. Notice that no matter what, it's going to increment and then return a value. This is the problem. So what we need to do is go back to our event graph. We're going to remove the slot placement from its current position. We're going to put it at the end. Then we're just going to use current row and current column as our addresses. Because now it'll be 0, 0 like it's supposed to be on the first like run through. And then we actually don't need this function. I overcomplicated it. So that is completely my apologies. I'm not a professional when it comes to the widgets. I'm so sorry. But for the sake of keeping it for now, this is what we'll leave it as. And we'll need to do it up here as well. So we'll go ahead and unplug our slot placement, drag it over, move the uniform grid placement to the left, use our current row and our current column and plug those in, and then we run the slot placement. So I hope you understand where I went wrong here. Now it still won't look great, but they'll actually be in the correct positions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. I'm so sorry. There's an ADHD medication shortage. I haven't taken my meds. I'm gonna edit this video as best I can. It has been it's been at least a while. That's all I can say, of just errors and all kinds of insanity. When I hit play, you can see mine looks correct now. The reason for that is because for current row, we need it to be 6 and not 10. And there you go. So now it'll actually populate 10 times across because I had it backwards. I thought row and column, and please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.